Ancient Beings of the Forest, Story 1. The Ancient Beings of the Forest. I had never thought that a forest could have a memory. To me, a forest was merely a place made of wood and darkness, somewhere people could lose their way. But 3 years ago, I went to work as a land surveyor in a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains, in a valley that the locals were afraid even to name. They didn't call it cursed. They simply acted as if such a place didn't exist at all. My job was to map the elevation near naturally formed ancient stone mounds. On my 3rd day, the air suddenly began to thicken, as if the oxygen filling my lungs with every breath had started to weigh on my body. I noticed that the trees at the center of the valley were not stretching toward the sun. All of them were leaning inward, toward a single point in the earth, their branches bent like limbs frozen in an act of worship. As I set up my equipment, I began to hear strange sounds. It was like a very faint hum. I felt it inside my head before I heard it with my ears. It was as if hundreds of voices were buried beneath rock, chanting a single, rhythmic syllable. When I checked my GPS, the screen was filled with constantly shifting symbols I couldn't make sense of. It wasn't an error. It looked like a language that was alive and breathing. Then I saw her. A woman was standing among the twisted trees. She wore an old, torn gray silk dress. Even though a storm-like wind had begun to blow through the valley, the dress did not move. Her skin was white like the moon in the sky. Her hair was like a mass of tangled vines. But what terrified me was her face. She had no eyes. Where her eye sockets should have been, there was only smooth, flat skin. Yet I knew, with horrifying certainty, that she could see every particle of my being. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. The hum grew stronger, vibrating up from the ground beneath my feet. She raised her hand into the air, and the earth began to ripple like the surface of the sea. The stone mounds I had come to survey began to crack open. Inside them was not soil or bone, but an empty darkness. That was when the voices began. But they were not coming from her. They were coming from the trees themselves. They spoke of a time before the universe was born, of an age when beings that did not understand mercy used the world as a playground. They called themselves the guardians of the root. They were not ghosts. They were the first architects of the world, and I was like a speck of dust drifting over their design. The woman began to move toward me. She did not move her legs. She glided through the air. The space around her warped and distorted, as if her presence was more than reality itself could bear. When she stretched her long, pale finger toward my forehead, a flood of memories that were not mine poured over me. I saw the rise and fall of civilizations in the blink of an eye. I saw oceans evaporate and mountains crumble into dust. "You are a guest in a house where you are not wanted," a voice shouted inside my head. It sounded like cracking stone and shifting tectonic plates. "Leave the offering or become a part of the forest." I didn't even wait to learn what the offering was. I left my expensive surveying equipment, my backpack, even my jacket, anything that tied me to the modern world, and I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the main road miles away. When I arrived at the village, the elders didn't ask what had happened. They only looked at my hair, which had turned completely white in just a few hours, and pointed to a small wooden bowl near the forest. Inside it were fresh fruits and small carved stones. In that moment, I realized they weren't superstitious. They were survivors. They knew that in the deepest places of the world, there are ancient beings that were old even when the first human was born, and that they will remain long after the last of us is gone. I still hear that humming in my sleep at night. Some nights I wake up and find my fingers covered in muddy, pitch-black soil, as if my body is trying to return to the valley that claimed my soul. The Lighthouse Keeper's Pact Story 2. The Lighthouse Keeper's Pact. I accepted the job at Black Rock Point because I wanted to get away.
A lighthouse perched on a jagged rock about 60 miles off the coast of Maine seemed like the perfect place to escape the past. The keeper before me hadn't left a note. One Tuesday morning, with his tea still warm on the table, he had simply walked into the ocean. For the first month, the only person I saw was the supply boat captain who dropped off crates of canned food and kerosene. But in the second month, a heavy fog arrived. This was not an ordinary mist. It was dense, yellow in color, and seemed to smell of ancient salt and rotting kelp. It didn't just hang in the air. It was as if it were a living creature crawling up the walls of the tower. That was when the tapping and knocking began, not at the door, but on the glass of the lantern room, 70 feet above the sea where the waves danced wildly. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just birds disoriented by the light, but birds don't knock rhythmically. Birds don't sound like heavy, wet knuckles striking reinforced glass. One night, driven by fear and panic, I grabbed my heavy flashlight and began climbing the spiral stairs. With every step, the knocking grew more intense. I entered the lantern room and shone the light toward the glass. There, on the window, was a hand. It was long, with more joints than it should have had, and its skin was translucent, a sickly pale blue, like the belly of a deep-sea fish. Between its fingers were thick, leathery webs. I lifted my head, and through the salt-covered glass, a face stared back at me. It was wide and flat, with rows of razor-sharp teeth and eyes the size of balls, glowing with a pale seaweed-green light. It wasn't trying to get inside. It was waiting. I backed away, but my foot caught on a loose floorboard. Beneath it, I found a leather-bound journal, the diary of the keeper before me. I opened the page dated the day he disappeared. It contained only one sentence, written over and over again in frantic, jagged handwriting. The tide has begun to rise in the basement, and they have come to take what is theirs. I ran toward the lowest level of the lighthouse. The heavy iron door of the storage room was bulging outward. Cold, pitch-black seawater was seeping through the cracks, but it wasn't like normal water. It moved with purpose, coiling around the legs of the table like a snake. From the darkness beneath the water, I saw dozens of those glowing green eyes blinking at me. They didn't want to kill me. They wanted the light. The hum that filled the room did not use words. It was made of clicks and whistles that echoed deep into my bones. They were the old ones of the trench, the silent rulers of the ancient depths. They told me that this rock had been their sacred temple long before humans built a tower upon it. The light was like a spear driven into their eye, a constant, agonizing scream in the home they called eternal darkness. The bargain was simple. On nights when the fog turns yellow, the light must remain off. Otherwise, the tower would become my tomb. Now, on those yellow nights, I turn off the light. I sit in absolute darkness, listening to the wet, heavy thuds of dozens of bodies slowly dragging themselves up the stone stairs. I hear them breathing behind my bedroom door, a muffled, horrifying sound like a drowning person trying to draw breath. I stay very still, clutching my crucifix, knowing that as long as the light remains off, I am allowed to live. But the fog is coming more often now, and last night I heard them whispering my name in a hoarse, terrifying language. I think they are tired of the rent. I think they want what is theirs back.
Story 3. The Whispering Gallery. I worked as a night security guard for 20 years, but I never told anyone why I left my job at the St. Jude Museum of Antiquities.
Most people think it's a boring job. They assume it's nothing more than walking through dark corridors with a flashlight. But the truth is, at St. Jude, silence was never truly silent. There was a special room on the top floor of the museum called the Whispering Gallery. It was a perfectly circular stone hall with a domed ceiling. Because of its acoustics, a word whispered against one side of the wall could be heard clearly by someone standing on the opposite side, as if they were right next to you. During the day, it was a popular spot for visitors, but at night, the gallery seemed to belong to something else. In my third week, I was once again on my midnight patrol. As I approached the gallery, I heard a sound. It wasn't a whisper. It was a muffled, wet, tearing noise, like a heavy rake being dragged through thick mud. I cracked open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside. The room was freezing cold compared to the rest of the museum. I slowly swept my flashlight along the wall. At first, I saw nothing. Then the beam struck the floor. In the center of the room was a gray, translucent pile that looked like shed snakeskins or dusty spider webs. But as I moved closer, I realized what they were. They were words. Thousands of phrases whispered by people over decades had somehow taken on physical form inside that room. They were twitching, shriveled husks of sound scattered across the floor. I love you. Please help me. Let this stay between us. The words lay there as thin gray membranes. A presence was crouching in the shadows of the room. It was tall, horrifyingly thin, and its skin was dark gray. It had no mouth or nose. Where its ears should have been were large funnels of flesh that never stopped moving. It was gathering the physical words from the floor and absorbing them into its skin. The creature suddenly turned toward me, but it didn't attack. It simply stood there, and all at once, every secret I had ever whispered in my life began to leave my mouth. I couldn't stop myself. My mouth stayed closed, but the words tore through my skin, bursting out as gray, translucent ribbons. The creature reached out and caught them one by one, tasting my deepest fears and my darkest shames. I felt a sudden emptiness in my chest. It wasn't taking my life, it was taking my memories. It was devouring the things that made me who I am. Every memory tied to a spoken word was being erased. I forgot my first love's name. I forgot the last words I said to my father before he died. I was becoming a blank page, a man without a past. At the last moment, I threw myself backward and managed to slam the doors shut. I ran out of the museum and never returned. I didn't even go back to collect my final paycheck. Now, I live in a world ruled by silence.